Few human beings are ever remembered for leading unparalleled lives of perversion and evil. Having captured him in 1934, New York authorities were shocked to discover that this seemingly innocent elderly man was suspected of kidnapping and murdering numerous children in and around Manhattan. Little did anyone know that in the years to come, the Gray Man would haunt New Yorkers' lives and become a living embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare. Sadomasochist, child murderer, and cannibal. He was Albert Fish.
From the haunted heartland in Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and I welcome you to this episode of the Necronomicast, where we bring you the horror of Hollywood and beyond. My guest tonight for a late-night conversation is John Borowski. He's an award-winning independent filmmaker whose works have garnered international acclaim. He's one of the most respected serial killer historians and researchers in these United States. Now we're going to dig a little deeper than most shows, all the way down into the crawl space tonight. And you're going to find the founding fathers of American terror, H.H. Holmes, Albert Fish, Carl Panzram. Now these are the guys who helped shape the nation's underbelly. And tonight, John Borowski, dedicated to chronicling the serial killer culture of America. So relax, turn on the lights. We're going to have a late night conversation with John Borowski. Calling in from Chicago on the Necronomicast hotline, another late night conversation. We're going to meet him down in the crawl space for this one. My guest is John Borowski. John, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the Necronomicast, Brian. I'm very excited. And yeah, I always tell people, just don't look in my crawl space or under the floorboards because you might not like what you find.
Right. Yeah. And we're talking about, we're alluding to, of course, John Wayne Gacy. You've got a new book, working on a movie. We'll talk about John Wayne Gacy in just a little bit, but I love that quote in the back of your brand new book where you said the only mistake Gacy made, and this is attributed to the Chicago Tribune paper, the only mistake Gacy made was burying the bodies under his home. So,
right, very true, very true. On one hand, it worked for a while, but then on the other hand, it was his ultimate undoing.
Yeah. I can't wait to start talking about that in a little bit. But John, we're having you on the show for the first time on the Necronomicast. I've been aware of you for a while. I caught your documentaries and your movies that you've made over the years. I first caught them on Netflix. I know that they're on Amazon Prime now that people can watch. But tell me a little bit about you growing up and how you came to be this expert on serial killers and serial killer culture.
Definitely. I grew up in Chicago and grew up on a healthy diet of horror films. Starting with, I blame it all on my sister. She really got me interested in all those when I was a kid, starting with the Universal horror films, of course, and Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. And, I really wouldn't know years later that some of those stories were actually based on true stories like Vlad the Impaler, or grave robbing. So it was kind of interesting that everything comes full circle. And as I grew older into my teen years, of course, then I couldn't get enough horror films. So I had to move into the slasher horror film genre and, couldn't get enough of those because, at that time period, growing up as a kid and the beginnings of VHS, I would go to the video rental store and the horror films were in a back dark corner. They were treated like porn films, with the big boxes and the crazy insane artwork, on the covers.
Sure.
To a kid, it was like candy in a sense. So it was like, couldn't get enough of them. So I'd rent all those. And, then, I started getting into special makeup effects because that's what I was interested in and initially wanted to go into as a career. So I would make masks and makeup and, of course, my relatives were all afraid of my bedroom and, would ask how could I sleep in there at night because I'd have horror-filled posters and masks. And, that's what I'm attracted to. I'm interested in the macabre and, Edgar Allan Poe and, the dark side of life and, those type of films. And which is kind of the antithesis of my personality. I'm very kind, caring, anti-war, anti-violence, down to earth. And, you see a lot, in life, people are labeled because they have all these tattoos or they look like, scary people, but they're actually, down to earth and kind people. And I've, met a lot of those type of people as well. So, and then, doing the makeup effects, I, really got into filmmaking, started filming 8mm films the old school way, pre-video, and editing those together and utilizing my special makeup skills to make those films. And my best friend at the time, his father was a police officer in Chicago, and he had access to the entire Dahmer report with Dahmer's confession and some of the photos that Dahmer had taken of his victims. And seeing those, I thought, well, this is different. This is like reality horror. This is the real stuff. This is the stuff that they base these Hollywood films on. So then I went into Columbia College and took filmmaking and, kind of changed it from makeup and then wanted to, make films. And in college, I learned about H.H. Holmes here in Chicago and his murder castle, that he designed this huge building and would rent rooms during the World's Fair of 1893, and would murder people and was an evil genius. And my next question is, why has no one ever made a film on this guy? So right out of college, I bought the first digital video camera, the VX1000, and started shooting H.H. Holmes. And that's, kind of ever since then, I'm kind of fell into this true crime serial killer horror niche where I do make short films, and eventually I'd like to make feature narrative films because that's what I went to school for. But I take that mentality and I put that into my documentaries. So they're not just boring, talking head and photographs. I try and throw everything into them, reenactments and location footage, to make them as interesting as possible. And I continued, with other serial killer films and a TV show, and I take the research material and I put it into books. So that's what I've been doing probably for these last 20 years.
When I was listening to you talk and like your background and everything, you're like a perfect guest for the Necronomicast, because our tagline here is the horror of Hollywood and beyond. And we talk about, horror movies. It's hard to talk a lot about them now because there's none being released because of the pandemic and all the theaters being closed. But we talk a lot about true crime and things like that and paranormal things like that. So when we have a filmmaker who also is a researcher talking about these serial killers, you're a great addition to the show. I first became aware of you. I was flipping through Netflix, and I found this documentary that you made about H.H. Holmes. And this was probably 6 or 7 years ago when I first watched it. And I never heard of H.H. Holmes. You grow up and you hear, stories about Bundy and Gacy. And we had a serial killer here in Nebraska, John Jubert. But I never heard of H.H. Holmes. His story is incredible. I just was watching. I'm like, nobody knew what was going on when he was building this, the murder castle, this elaborate building in Chicago.
Yeah, it was. That's one of the questions. Now anyone that knows the Chicago way, I always say Chicago is the city of serial killers, gangsters, and corrupt politicians.
Yeah.
Well, and if you look at the history of Illinois, I mean, all the governors and all the issues we've had and the corruption in the city, that's the history of the city. And who knows, at that time, people wonder, how did H.H. Holmes get away with that? Well, number one, did building codes even exist in the 1880s and 90s when he built that place? Who knows? Were they as strict as they are now? Probably not. Even if there were, he could have just paid off the inspectors. We all know that. So, H.H. Holmes was a master con man, manipulator, evil genius who built a career out of crime. I mean, you name it, he did it. Realty scams, life insurance scams, murdering men, women, and children. And studying these serial killers, when serial killer and serial homicide profiling first began, we thought it was the end all, that, oh yeah, these profilers will know that these killers are in their 30s, they live in this certain area, and they should be easy to find. But what we've learned since then, and it's changed dramatically, that each one of these murderers or offenders must be studied individually. You can't put that wide swath on them and say, well, they're all cruel to animals, fire starters, and bedwetters, which is what they initially said about serial killers. So, and H.H. Holmes was definitely one of these, anomalies, and is considered America's first documented serial killer. There were serial killers before H.H. Holmes, but none of them literally laid the groundwork like H.H. Holmes did, and designed this huge building, and was so ambitious with his scams and cons and schemes that, everyone sees him as the kind of the forefather of serial killing in America, and it would have made a boring title for a film if I would have put America's first documented serial killer.
Right. So, but he's said to have killed as many as 200. I know that's attributed a lot to, the kind of sensationalist writing at the time. He brought them into his place and built this elaborate structure to facilitate murder.
Yeah, he was very similar to like a Dennis Nilsen, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, where their, locations where they lived and or worked were actually their bases of murder and, body concealment and burial. Some, again, when we may talk about necrophilia later, and somewhere and into that. But yeah, it's very interesting that H.H. Holmes did that. And eventually, when he did leave the building to enact further scams, that's where, he did other murders, on the road when he was traveling with his victims, with the Peitzel family. But you're right. And, when H.H. Holmes was first arrested, they thought it was just for insurance fraud, because they had no idea what was going on in this building in Chicago. And even when they went into his building, the investigators, they didn't find a shred of evidence. They found things, but at that time period, well, they found blood. But in 1893, they couldn't even identify if it was human or animal blood typing at that time period. So they didn't really know what they were dealing with, the enormity of the case, until they realized, okay, he was traveling with these 3 children. Now they're gone. So they sent a detective in Philadelphia out to find these children, who diligently went state to state, door to door, based on these letters that one of the victims wrote. And he found all of their bodies eventually. And then, of course, Holmes was the arch fiend and, the world's worst monster and America's, first serial killer. And they looked into his past. And, it's kind of like that Elizabeth Bathory. And I don't know if many people know of who she is, but she was the Countess Bathory who supposedly bathed in the blood of virgins, and I interviewed expert Kim Kraft on my show, Serial Killer Culture TV, and she dispels a lot of those rumors. But, at that time period, like you're saying, it was the sensationalism. And even in the Gacy case, I found a lot of sensationalism, because I see my job as very much similar to a detective. When I'm on the search for truth for my documentary films, I don't want to place something in my film that I cannot prove is a truth, because they're called documentary films for a reason. Now, the History Channel, that's a whole nother story. They should probably be called the Unhistory Channel or False History Channel, because sometimes I watch their programs and I have no idea where they're getting this information from. But it's important for me to tell the truth in all of these, true crime tales.
Yeah, and I'll have to give you some compliments here, because I was watching these films. You have shows on documentaries. You've got them on H.H. Holmes, like we've been talking about. Great production values. Albert Fish, which I have to say, I didn't really know much about. I've read a little bit here and there about Albert Fish, but take this the right way. I was really uncomfortable watching the Albert Fish documentary just because of the nature of his crimes and the way he's portrayed. And you don't do it in a sensationalistic way. It's very truthful. Like you said, it's very well researched and very laid out exactly what he did exactly how he did it. So, there's no room for, making stuff up in your mind. I mean, they're very, very specific with the descriptions of his crimes. So you get the idea of what he did. Same thing with Carl Panzram. I really enjoyed that one. I was like, man, I can't believe I didn't know these, like Albert Fish and Carl Panzram weren't like, like a household name, like a Ted Bundy or something like that, but just diabolical crimes. Fascinating documentaries on those two guys.
Yeah, those were lesser knowns. And after H.H. Holmes, I thought, well, who could I follow it up with? And no one had ever done a film on Albert Fish. And I thought, wow, I mean, this, to me, he is the worst, I feel, because of what he did to children, tortured children, just to hear their cries and screams. Plus, he, tortured himself as a sort of the self-penance because he had a religious complex. But that's flattery. Believe me, when we screened the film at first at the Vine Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, several people walked out, and that was a compliment to me. That meant I did my job in a sense to where, I moved people. And that's what I wanted them to either be, emotionally jarred by it or disgusted because, these were true events and they did happen. I mean, it's, I don't know how you could gloss over cannibalism, but, it's interesting that, as you're saying, the content. So you could watch my film and turn the audio down. And there are sections where there are reenactments, and it's just a kind old man cooking a stew or cooking, a soup. But it's a combination. When you combine his audio of his letters that he wrote to his victims' families, plus the visuals, that I think is when people, get a little queasy, uneasy. And I always tell people, well, just make sure you haven't, ate before you watch the film.
Yeah, and you brought it up, the audio portion. You had, for those two films, the first two, you had the wonderful talents of Tony Jay on your documentaries and just his wonderful baritone voice. How did you get Tony Jay involved on those?
Yeah, he was great. I was always a fan of Tony Jay's, going back to, I think the first time I had really... I had heard his voice in productions before, but when I had seen Disney's Beauty and the Beast, he was the asylum keeper, the voice of that in the original animated film, and then the animated Hunchback, where he was the Judge Frollo, the villain. And I thought, man, this guy's voice is perfect for documentaries like this. So there were two people I went after. I sent letters out to agents for Tony Jay and James Earl Jones, who people know as Darth Vader, the voice of Darth Vader.
Sure.
Because, I wanted that deep, believe me, if Vincent Price was alive, he would have to do it. I would force him to do it because, that voice and me being, he's like my number one, my favorite horror actor, classic actor. So if he was around, believe me, I even thought of like, is there any way where I could get just, bare audio of him and I could make narration? I just want, like if I got clean readings of Vincent Price without any extraneous,
Yeah.
And his family loved to use his voice, I could just piece together a narration,
If he was good enough for Michael Jackson, he's good enough for me, right?
Right. So, but yeah, Tony Jay was great to work with. And, for me, it was just like when we first sat down, he said, well, I'm thinking of reading this in a Mid-Atlantic. And I'm like, and, when somebody says that, with all that experience, it's like, yes, your greatness, it's like, I was a kid. That was my first movie, but, and of course I would direct him, but, with someone like that, you would just, with him, it was great. I would just say, well, at the end there, could you do a different, like a finality? He would say, okay, a little thing at the end. Okay. He would do it. And that was it. Okay. Next, move on, one take. And it was great. And, I always think it's important to have a great narrator voice, especially if they're named, because you get that recognition. That's why I chose John DiMaggio for Panzram, who was the voice of Bender the robot in Futurama.
Right. Panzram, another case, another serial killer that I didn't know much about. A little bit different in some ways. I hesitate to say that I was not sympathetic with him sometimes, but just a horrible background on him, adolescent or even, he was a child drinker, just beat horrible existence growing up. It's no wonder that he kind of turned out the way he did. And at the end, he just kind of wanted to be left alone, you know?
Yeah, that's what he said. He had said, hey, I mean, I think a lot of people would like this. Just, hey, send me to an island with a dog and no people. I'd be happy. But, he wouldn't. That's what he said. There were a lot of things. And releasing my latest book, Panzram at Leavenworth, it really got me thinking about Panzram's story once again. Whereas Panzram built himself up because, of course, he had been through all these abuses and had this awful childhood. So what was his reaction? Might makes right. I got to be the strongest guy that I am. So if anyone tries to rape me or get one over on me, I got to do it first. But, when he's at Leavenworth where he kills the laundry foreman because he said he would kill the first guy that bothered him, which, he did. And then they throw him in a cell. They don't beat him. They don't whip him. They don't electrocute him. They don't torture him at all. And they're serving him better meals than he has ever had in prison in his life. So at that point, he says, you know what I'm thinking? If I was treated this way a long time ago, maybe there wouldn't be so many people that were robbed, raped, or murdered. So he knew that might doesn't make right. He knew that if you treat people and other human beings with kindness, you'll get further than with just beating them or, and we're still going through this. I recently had a conversation with, an important person, in the criminal justice system. And we're still going through these issues. We're still going through, these prisoners, wanting change and hiring the wrong officers who just want to go in there and beat them. And, instead of, saying, well, why don't we go in there and ask them what the issue is and treat them like a human instead of first grabbing the gas and, grabbing the jacket and, knocking them to the ground, and Panzram said it himself. He said it happened yesterday, it happened today, and it's going to happen 100 years from now. And when Panzram was strung up at the Washington, D.C. District Jail, that was an important event. Not many people realize that, but he was strung up, left to hang there. And this was in, and he said it himself, where the capital of the country is. So, it's important on many, different, levels as far as treating people better in law enforcement and prisons and how they're run and, how these violent offenders are, either ignored or, just thrown into a prison, or are they reformed? So many interesting aspects to Carl Panzram's life.
So we've gotten Panzram, H.H. Holmes. We talked Albert Fish. You have these books out too, in addition to your documentaries. First class book. I got the John Wayne Gacy Hunting a Predator right here. Nice. On the desk. John Wayne Gacy, you have Dahmer's Confession, Albert Fish in his own words. You just mentioned you had the Panzram book. When you're putting these projects together, are you putting together the movie first, or are you kind of thinking like, are they companion pieces to each other? Do you kind of formulate them at the same time?
It's usually the film first that, I'm acquiring all this research for, and then the book is kind of the after product of all my research, and sometimes it is complementary. Like I think the Panzram book, they're all pretty much complementary. Like, you could watch the films and read the books and you'll garner different information from both because, obviously one's more of a moving visual medium and the other is, more of a probably more intimate, where you're reading about these stories. And there's nothing, I think more important and graphic than reading the words from, these killers themselves or the wardens who cared for them or, the detectives or the attorneys. And that's what comprises my books. It's all of those documents where we could learn things about these violent offenders or their situations or why they did what they did. So the books I think are a little bit more introspective, but yeah, it's a great question. They usually come after, but I'd like to get to a point where I start working on just the books themselves. So, even if I don't do a film on a serial killer, I may start releasing the books because the books for me are a little bit, they're also intimate for me as well, because it's just me working on them and maybe some people will collaborate, or add, to the book, but it's not like filmmaking where you need huge casts and crew and, huge, budget to make these things where, I could do a lot of it remotely and then compile it myself.
Sure. And you were talking about your research, and I was looking through this John Wayne Gacy book that I got here in my hand. I read it, and now I'm kind of thumbing through it. When you're doing this research, do you have much trouble getting all this paperwork? Because you've got copies of detective reports, you've got all these official documents, I guess from the Chicago or the Illinois Department of Corrections, and also the Chicago Police Department, things like that. Do you have trouble getting those things? Are those hard to get?
Usually they are. I mean, some of these things get buried. The problem with over time, official documents can get lost. They could get destroyed by flood or fire damage. People steal them and they either keep them as trinkets or artifacts, or they resell them because, as we know, true crime is big now.
Mm-hmm.
I call them, I say it's selling artifacts because I don't like that, nasty name of murderabilia, because I see these as true crime artifacts, whether it's a mugshot or something, I mean, when I look at that murderabilia label, I look at less the things like, these serial killers will send out underwear or, toenail clippings and weird crap like that it's like, that's a little different. But for me, the artifact and, even their artwork could be interesting. So, that's the furthest I go with, any type of that stuff. And, I've written to some killers have written to me, but it's usually in the interest of, studying and researching and, for these books. But it's correct. All that stuff is hard to find, all the research. And as the years go by, it's more difficult to find these items because they are becoming either more buried or people are looking for them to collect or sell. And, and I'm against that in a sense, because especially if these are official documents, they should be either at locations where researchers like myself could access them. And that's another reason why I release these books with some of the research information in them, so that, if somebody's interested in the case, I'm kind of doing them a favor. For $20-$30, they buy my book and I'm saving them hundreds of dollars and, all this travel and time, for the research.
Yeah. Now you're also, you have this web series, television show, and one of your documentaries too was called Serial Killer Culture. And you're talking and kind of showing people that do collect artwork, correspondence, relics of serial killers. And I found that incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, all that is definitely fascinating. As I was making my films, of course, I met a lot of people within this, what I call the serial killer culture. Whether they are, and, it's a broad topic, and a lot of people fall into it, whether they are a detective, whether they are an artist who does a work based on a serial killer, a musician who writes a song based on a serial killer, an author who writes a book on a killer, a forensic psychologist, anyone that is in this field doing something with serial killer, whether it be an artist, a professional, they fall within that serial killer culture. So I had met a lot of people into the culture, and I thought, well, it would be interesting to get a bunch of these people together and put them in a film, especially some that are kind of like our forefathers of collecting, like Rick Staten, who was Gacy's art dealer. You have Joe Coleman, who is an artist and wrote and met many of these serial killers.
Yes, Joe. I want to talk about Joe Coleman because I found him incredibly interesting.
Joe Coleman, he's very fascinating. I mean, he wrote to many serial killers and they wrote to him. Gacy did a painting of him and, and again, you see it in the film. No one had sent Joe Coleman, a word of condolence when his mother passed away from cancer, but John Wayne Gacy sent him a birthday card. A card, of sorrow, just basically saying, how sorry he was and that his mother died and he hoped she didn't suffer. Here's the guy that, murdered, 33 or 34 young men, but yet he's, hoping, Joe Coleman's mother doesn't suffer. But that's the duality of these serial killers. Can they be actually caring people? And at the same time, at night, a murderous werewolves? Yeah, it seems they can. BTK said, hey, I was a good guy that did some bad things. which is an understatement, but it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And they are humans. That's the thing I always say. My one regret is calling H.H. Holmes a monster, because when serial killers are apprehended, or the cuffs are put on them, or they walk into a jail or prison, they don't grow fangs and horns. They're still human beings. And I feel it's our job as a society to figure out why they're doing these things.
Yeah, like you mentioned BTK. I remember when all that was going, when he was getting arrested and the trial and the aftermath and all that. Dennis Rader's daughter wrote about how it was his dad. It was her dad. He wasn't this monster, even though he is. I mean, he is. To her, it was her dad. He worked for the city of Wichita for I don't know how many decades. He was a respected member of his church. And even somebody like John List, I mean, he's not a serial killer. He was more of I guess they call him family annihilators now. Right. John List killed his entire family, but had all these longstanding relationships with people in the community. Then he abandoned those, but he set up new ones again. So it's like they're not entirely devoid of empathy, but at the same time, this disorder that's within them, it's so strange. John Wayne Gacy he was a business leader. He was a respected man in the community until they started putting two to two together.
Yeah, I mean, and Gacy is a perfect example of that duality. Here he was, business owner, lived in the suburbs, had a wife and kids, would dress up as a clown for charity events, would, shovel the streets for his neighbors, would go out of his way to be kind to people. But, obviously there may have been some things that Gacy did, and some other serial killers may have done that people didn't notice or would write off as their personality. And it's very difficult, because no one wants to think their husband, their son, their friend is a serial killer. We wouldn't think that. But, studying the Gacy case, there were little things that I noticed, like one time, I think his mother said she was in the car with him and he got stopped by a police officer for speeding. And he made up this whole thing about his mother was sick and he had to get her to the hospital. He was a liar and a con man. Mm-hmm. Those are sociopathic traits. But, again, we would never think, my son, husband, friend is a murderer, killing people, but, for him, he conned a lot of people, and, he pulled it off, ultimately he was caught because I think, that last murder, he thought, he was basically, that nothing, no harm could come to him, that he was inescapable from ever, becoming, apprehended. Yeah. But, he wasn't. That last victim was the one that did him in.
And what a credit to the police force that brought him in too. And maybe was it his ego that kind of led to his downfall too, because he invited the police officers to go bowling. He invited them into his house. They came into his house and then they smelled something coming up from the crawl space. But I mean, he had an ego. He had that pathological lying. That he thought he could talk his way out of anything.
That's what it was. And even, when they brought him in the last time, when they, had found the body, one of the bodies in the crawl space, he had told one of the detectives, I'm not going to serve any time for this. So even when they had, when they knew he was caught, when he knew, he still had that ego. You're right. I mean, because he figured, look, I had friends over, I had people over. When he killed his first victim, nobody came looking for him. So he was probably thinking, wow, I got a great thing here that, maybe I could do this. I could please myself, do all the fun that I want and torture all the people that I want, bury them in my crawl space. And then we'll have parties in the backyard like it never happened.
Unbelievable. I mean, Gacy's a legendary monster.
Yeah. But when you would talk to neighbors, friends, family, everybody that the detectives talk to. He's a great guy. He's so kind. He's so funny. He's just this outgoing Polish guy from Chicago that wants to help people, but the detectives, the Desplaines detectives, like you said, they are the true heroes in the story, because when they looked into his record further, that's when they found, okay, the sodomy conviction in Iowa, and ever since he was back in Chicago for those last, 8 years, he had been arrested, domestic disturbance, something's going on here. So it was really the Desplaines police force that did something that was not done in this entire country at the time. They formed a task force. They were the first ones to do that type of thing. They had never done a task force in this country for serial killers. It was the Desplaines Police Department, a little, suburb here of, Chicago, Illinois. But what they did, was groundbreaking. And if they didn't do it, who knows? Because I have a friend. Now, you hear these stories all over Chicago. A friend of a friend said this, but
yeah,
my friend said that he knew a realtor or read about a realtor in the newspaper when Gacy was arrested. And the realtor said they remembered Gacy looking at a house they were trying to sell, and Gacy only wanted to see the size of the basement, how large the basement was. So obviously, he was going to continue, because, he was just going to keep continuing because he had a good thing going there. And that he said it himself. I ran out of room in the crawl space, and that's when he started throwing them in the Desplaines River.
Yeah. He threw a few in the way. How many did they pull out of the crawl space?
They, it's 26 out of the crawl space. And then it was, I believe, 27, 28, 29. There were 3 on his property outside of the crawl space. There was one in the garage, one under the driveway, and one under another addition that he had built. And then there were 4 that he threw in the river, but it may have been 5 because they didn't find the one.
I keep going back to these detectives, and I was reading through your book, The Hunting a Predator, and thinking about these police officers. And this is decades ago, before the World Wide Web, before cellular telephones. I mean, these guys were using CB radios. They had to use they had to use pay phones. I mean, they were real gumshoe detectives.
Yeah, they told me the one, Dave Hackmeister said we'd have to carry a pocket full of quarters with us because they had no reception. So here, again, you think of this, John Wayne Gacy, the most probably, top 5, top 3 serial killers ever, world renowned. And these detectives, they caught him using these archaic methods. But again, it's that diligency of detective work that I always say that, no matter how much technology you have, because you go back and look at these cases like the Gacy case, Albert Fish, that they apprehended these, people from little slivers of evidence, really. And no one believed that, he was burying people in his crawl space. Even at the end, it wasn't like until the day or two before that they said, okay, the one cop went in there, the detective, and he smelled a smell coming from the basement. Maybe that's where he's at. But they didn't, because again, who in their at that time period in the 70s would think, well, this contractor's, killing kids and, putting them in his crawl space. There wasn't even a thought on their mind.
Yeah. Can you imagine what was going through the police officer's mind when he was using the toilet at John Wayne Gacy's house? He's like, and he's just like, wait a second. It's insane. It's absolutely insane, and it's all true. That's why these movies like you create, these documentaries that you create, way stranger than anything that comes out of Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood waters it down, it seems like, for their movies.
Oh yeah, they do, and that's the thing. The truth is stranger than fiction, and I know they've been grappling, with trying to make a film on H.H. Holmes and The Devil in the White City. I mean, every year they say something new. Now it's this, now it's that, now it's Hulu, then it was this, but there's still no traction on H.H. Holmes' film and Devil in the White City. If they gave me a budget and that project, this thing would have been done like 10 years ago. I could do this in a heartbeat. But, like you're saying, they probably quibbling over, oh, well, what do we put? What do we not put? Should we,
Mm-hmm.
fictionalize it? Should we not? I had met one of the first writers on the project, Christopher Kyle. He had wrote the movie called Key 19, The Widowmaker with Harrison Ford. So they had shown my film at Indiana State University. This was like 20 years ago. And he said, well, Paramount Pictures wouldn't let me watch your movie because they're afraid if there's anything in my script, they would sue us, but that I would sue them. But then he said, well, in my script, I have H.H. Holmes, leaving bodies around the World's Fair site. And, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, well, H.H. Holmes was much smarter than that. He wouldn't be foolish to leave bodies laying around.
No.
So that's what happens. They try and fictionalize this stuff.
Right.
But it's like, if you could stick to the true story, and work with that to make it effective, and that's what I think they're grasping. They don't know how to do it.
No, why leave bodies around when you have chutes in your place delivering bodies down to the basement and airtight rooms with gas chambers in them?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, that's what you focus on. Any day, believe me, if Hollywood wants to talk to me, my idea is what you'd have for that story. You'd have to do like Peter Jackson did with The Lord of the Rings. You have to do 3-hour films. First one focuses on Chicago and the castle. Second one goes back to when Holmes began, when he was in college and how he got all the scams and schemes started. And then you end it when he's doing all the cross-country journeying stuff. And the last one is really the deaths of the children, the trial, and the wrap-up. You can't fit his story into 2 or 3 hours. It's got to be an epic. There's so much.
No, I know, and your documentary does such a great job. But man, it moves. I mean, it's paced well. I really enjoyed it. I felt like watching it. Then I kind of researched you a little bit, and then I researched you more before bringing you on the program. I was amazed at the amount of research, and that was your first film. How you put that together, and I know you studied it, and that was your vocation in college. But for your first film, man, talk about knocking it out of the park with information and also, making it compelling to watch.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, and that was, the whole, inception behind it. And, when I had the rough cut, when there were no reenactments, I even told myself, I've got to do something to take this to the next level, because if I'm watching this, I would like to see how, it may have looked inside his building or something to bring it up to the next level. And then the sound was a big thing too. I hired a great composer who had worked on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and an Angel, the show, and then got Tony J. So, I knew that the audio had to be just as good as the images, and it's very interesting. You look back at H.H. Holmes, that I shot that on mini DV. It's still standard definition. It's not 16:9. It's not 4K. It's not 8K, but it's still the best selling and most interesting film of all the ones I've done because of that story. That shows that if you have a great story, and if you're creative, you could come up with something that people will be interested in much more than something that is shot with a, $500 million camera and all this stuff into it. If there's no heart and soul or story, then it's just unemotional, and it's just there.
Yeah. Now I got to ask you, you kind of alluded to it earlier. I was just wondering, now you make these documentaries, you write these books, you have the television web series and documentary Serial Killer Culture. Do you get correspondence from incarcerated serial killers?
Sometimes I do. There were several that wrote me. Keith Jesperson, the Happy Face Killer, he wrote me. Initially, he wanted to collaborate on a project. I didn't write him back at first because, again, I'm interested in the extreme psychological stories, whereas Keith Jesperson, was a trucker, would pick up prostitutes and murder them and throw them off the road. And that's, I'm not demeaning the victims. It's just not as interesting as like a cannibal or a vampire story. And then I waited a while and then wrote him back, and we wrote a year about possibly collaborating on a project. But, he just strung me along. That's how these serial killers are. When it came time to say, hey, let's do this, I've got people interested, let's do this, he backed off. And that's fine. I've written to others such as Dennis Rader and, the Starved Rock killer, who was actually paroled. So he's out on parole now, but he wrote me as well, asking, since I'm local here in Illinois, if I might have been able to help him. But then he was paroled. So, it's interesting. They all have their own agendas because, whether, they want just people to write them because they're bored, or if they want something, if you could help them from the outside. But rarely know, again, especially with these stories that I have, the offenders are usually, long gone. The Gacy film is the most contemporary serial killer story I've made as far as a biography on him. And it's been interesting working with the people that are alive now that, either worked on his case or worked with him so I could get the truth. There were some people that I interviewed and I showed them the questions and they said, well, where'd you get all this from? Where's this? Where'd you hear this from? I said, got this all from all the books that are out. And this person I interviewed said, well, no, they're wrong. I'm like, well, how do I find the truth? And really, that's the hard part, the search for the truth, getting to those original documents. Because everything is hearsay. Oh, no, he probably murdered so many. He had accomplices, this and that. Especially with Gacy, there's dozens of all these conspiracy and weird theories that are out there. And I'm going to disprove every one of them in my film.
Yeah, you're working on that film now, and I know things got sidetracked a little bit because of COVID, but what are you planning to do with this John Wayne Gacy film?
Actually, I have enough material. It's my goal. It's kind of transformed from a film. I'd like to make it into a miniseries. So I'd like to make it into kind of like what they did with that last Ted Bundy, like a 5-part, 6-part miniseries. I've edited. I have a long rough cut now, so it's just getting in there and working with what I have and trying to do what I can under lockdown. I've been doing some things, here and there alone, and then the next step is to see what I could do, maybe, safely with others. Keep the crew small, maybe one other person. But, again, it's scary at the same time. So I'm trying to be, cautious, but yet, I did take a little pause from the film, but now I'm back full force and, working on it again. And I really I'm thinking the miniseries because I have, I was interested in the Gacy case for numerous reasons, especially how I saw that we had all these similarities, that we both grew up in Chicago. We both grew up on the Northwest Side. Later, I even learned that one of his high schools was the high school that I went to. We're both Polish. I mean, the only thing is that he said his clown persona, he was Pogo, Polish and on the go. Well, I tell people I'm Polish and on the go, but in a good way. Because it's like there are similarities, but it pretty much ends there. But, again, just going to all these different locations in Chicago and seeing how they are. When I filmed this last winter in Park Ridge, where his attorney's office was, where he stayed there all night, he confessed to his attorney and the detectives were outside. When I was filming out there in the winter, in the middle of night, I was out there at like 10 or 11 at night. You could literally, and I'm not kidding, you could drop a pin and hear it drop. That's how quiet it was out there. Wow. So that's why you think of these suburbs around O'Hare Airport or further away from Chicago, they're quiet, they're dark, and that's why they're unassuming. And nothing bad happens out there. It's always the bad stuff happens in the city. Well, of course, he would pick his victims up in the city and take them out to Norwood Park.
I interviewed a couple of years ago, a journalist by the name of Mark Pettit, and he wrote a book about John Joubert. Are you familiar with the Joubert case at all?
Yes. Yeah.
Mark was great on the show, and his book is called A Need to Kill. And he had a lot of correspondence with Joubert and everything before he was executed. And when you were talking about Gacy and the quietness and the suburbs and everything, a friend of mine built a house around the area where where Joubert's dumping ground was for his victims here in Nebraska, and it's just crazy to drive around these different parts of Omaha that are described in his book. Like the detective work with Joubert really kind of led to his downfall. Now, Joubert also kind of spun out of control at the end, but what nailed him at the end was that he was using a very specific kind of rope to bind his victims, and that rope was like unique to the Air Force where he was stationed here in Omaha, nearby in Bellevue off at Air Force Base. So like detective work was just this kind of the same. These gumshoe detectives, because no stone was left unturned. They finally tracked him down, but yeah, things it's weird to drive around these different parts of Omaha and like these new sprawling suburban communities are coming up in what was like desolate farmland where he dumped his bodies,
Yeah, and again, that's what I say. I believe it all comes down to tried and true detective work because, of course they smelled the smell when they went in Gacy's house, and they had this past evidence, and they had found strange things in his house. Of course, that led them to think, okay, he's having weird S&M or something's going on that we don't know. But there were things such as when they found the film receipt in the garbage can at his house, and tracked that back to the girl that worked with his last victim at the drugstore, and it was her film receipt that she put in the kid's jacket, and that's what was with him when Gacy picked him up and murdered him, and that's how the film receipt got in the garbage can. So little things like that, one or two pieces of evidence, and you've got it, but you put that together with all these other pieces of evidence, and learning from these cases, I'm going to be, moving into becoming a private investigator as well, while still, making these documentaries. But I think I would do a great job because, you have to kind of know the mindset of some of these offenders and, the steps they might take, those next steps, and put those pieces together.
So you're working towards becoming a private investigator?
Yeah, that's a goal of mine that, in my second half of my life, I'm looking into that, at least looking into it because it's something that would interest me because, again, it's kind of what I'm doing now. It's researching, it's finding the truth, and that's what it is. It's, I saw an excellent show, one of these, cable shows where this detective solved the case. He was a private investigator. An insurance company hired him because this woman was raped in a hotel, but they couldn't figure out how it happened. And it turned out that this guy had put the victim in a large suitcase that he had, and that showed up on the video that he had to lift the suitcase out of the elevator. And this detective said that was it. There was so much weight in there that he knew that's how she got her out. And, I have that kind of mentality, and how I put things together on, studying things and looking at those details very closely from making these films. So I think I would make a great private investigator.
Well, I'll have to agree with you because I just don't know where you're going to find the time because you have, you made time. Thank you for being on this program, but you're an author. You publish these books. You speak to universities. You go to conventions. You make these documentaries, web shows. I see on your website, johnborowski.com, you have a program here. You have a Crimes of Our Times that you host, a live show that you do on there. I mean, I don't know where you're going to find the time, man, but
I learned from Gacy, be Polish on the go, but in a good way. Like I said, it's good to be busy. So, and the future is open. We'll see, obviously, if I get more deals in the film industry and that keeps going, it's an ebb and flow. And, I as long as I'm interested in what I'm doing, I'm interested in true crime. I'm interested in criminal justice. I'm interested in horror films, science fiction, fantasy, stuff like that. So video games, I have many interests. So, I always say that, whatever direction life takes me to, I'll be happy. But my website is a great resource. Like you said, it's johnborowski.com. That's my main website. And then I have a store. It's store.johnborowski.com. And that's where people could purchase autographed items such as posters, DVDs, books. And that's a great resource. My films are all streaming on Amazon Prime, so they could be viewed there, including Bloodlines, my film on artist Vincent Castiglia, who paints in human blood.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, that one doesn't really fit into the true crime genre, but it fits into the macabre genre, where obviously, all this other stuff falls into the heavy metal music and the interest in blood and the macabre and H.R. Giger. And, when you see that, there's so many connections there as well. But now my films have actually, through Film Hub, they've reached a wider distribution. So people should be able to see them in other English-speaking countries such as Australia and other territories. This started last June. So they're getting out there a little more because since the pandemic hit, I hooked up with this company called Film Hub, and they're trying to distribute the films to wider audiences.
And also, I watched the serial killer culture documentary that you made, the feature length one, and then I'm not done with both seasons, but I started watching the TV show, the web series, serial killer culture, where you kind of spotlight people like even Gigi Allen's brother, Merle Allen. That was totally fascinating. I've been following Gigi Allen and Merle Allen for years, ever since Gigi died. But I noticed that they're also on VidiSpace. And a couple episodes back, we had Elizabeth Saint, who's one of the founders of VidiSpace. Serial Killer Culture, the web series, is on VidiSpace for people to watch there too.
Great. Well, get me in touch with her because I'm looking for a budget. If people want to see more of this stuff, I need budgets. And that's what, I had reached out to VidiSpace, but I didn't reach out to, her, but, just, the people that gotten back to me, and how that goes. But that's the thing, I'm looking for budgets. And right now, it's a strange climate because Hollywood is on lockdown. But, again, I don't understand or get the concept of indies being ignored, and we're still ignored. But it's like, if anyone in power or with money hears this or has knowledge, use us indies during this. We could fit in, we could get out, we could do things that big productions can't do. I could grab my camera and equipment right now and film things. You can't organize a crew to do that under lockdown. So, use us, pay us, that's what we're here for. But, everyone has this idea that only the big boys produce quality work. Only it has to be expensive. You've got to have crews of hundreds, or, it's not like that. Things have changed. Almost all my stuff I produce all on my own. I grab my gear, I go out, I set it up, I interview somebody, I break it down, I go to the next thing. There is power in being the smaller guy because, you could swim through things quicker than the big boats.
Yeah, and I don't pretend that I'm like this world renowned great host or anything, but it's even with the podcast revolution too. There are interesting stories out there, and there's people that want to listen to people talk. They want to listen to interesting stories, and then people will listen to this, and then they've never heard of John Borowski, and they'll go investigate the films of you and your books, and learn about Holmes and Fish and Panzeram and all these serial killers. I was trying to think of a different word, but I think I'll just say serial killer. But yeah, like you said, independent artists out there, they're out there creating, and there is this pandemic going on when people are at home and they're starved for entertainment. They're starved for information. They're starved for something to keep their minds off of, and things to challenge them intellectually and stimulate them in ways. And what I like about your show, they're not sensationalistic, like you're like glorifying these murders, because we've been talking a lot about the police work on these shows, but I was watching your shows and you get a full, complete look at their lives from the beginning, middle, their crimes, their incarceration, and then also how they died, and then the impact later. That's what I find interesting. It's not just, the gore and the blood and guts and things like that, or what they did. It's also like their impact on society that we're still feeling to this day.
Yes, and that's what's so important, because I always say that these stories aren't all just about the gore. Of course, that's what pulls people in initially. This Ed Gein made furniture out of skin, and elderly Albert Fish was this cannibal who drank this girl's blood and ate her. Of course. But it's the context. Like, I had watched a documentary on Richard Chase. He would drink blood and he was known as a vampire. But that's all they talked about. 1 hour documentary. It was just, sensationalism after sensationalism. Never once did they say he was a schizophrenic. But like you're saying, the society, has a lot to play in this too. And, that's going to play a big part in my Gacy film. Is it, when you look at Gacy's life, and the time period he lived in, yes, the 60s and 70s were still swinging, and it was more acceptable to have all this wild sex. But you couldn't say you were more than bisexual. That you could say that, hey, you're maybe a little hip and a little cool to say that. But if you said you were gay, you better kiss goodbye to your business. You better kiss goodbye to your family, kiss goodbye to your everything. And, look at what Gacy did. He buried his bodies just like he buried his sexuality, so that's going to play a big part of my documentary.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, before the sun comes up, I got to ask you though, when you're doing these research and you're thinking about your next project, do you ever look at something and be like, whew, does something totally give you the shivers and I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can deep dive into that.
Yeah. I mean, some of these, even, I don't know if you could call them extreme, they're all extreme cases,
right. Right.
But I mean, I think if I, handled Fish and Gacy and Holmes, I think I could handle others, because I'm not saying that, it doesn't affect me, but, seeing all this and having an interest in it from an early age, I'm not desensitized to it because, believe me, I'm very, sensitive and emotional. But how I deal with it is I have to take breaks. I watch, cartoons, Disney movies, and play some video games. Some Mario Brothers, Animal Crossing. Things are, there's no murdering, there's no, killing. It's just all nice and fun. I mean, I play the Die Hard games too, but it's good. You have to take breaks, and and then in those breaks, like this break from Gacy was a good break because now I'm coming back and seeing it with fresh eyes and seeing what can be done with it.
Yeah, man, fresh eyes. Go out and watch a baseball game or something.
Yeah, definitely. Let's watch the Cubs.
Right. There you go. John, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I want to thank you for your patience with me. I know, we sent emails back and forth, and we set up dates, and things don't work, and it's like schedules, and then COVID, and then everything's going on. But to have you on the program has been just an absolute treat. And you've been absolutely wonderful to deal with or to work with online and everything too. So I just have a lot of respect for you as a filmmaker and putting your product out there. You just do a really good job, and I'm just really happy to have you on the program.
Thank you, Brian, so much. And it's been an honor to have been on the Necronomicast, and I'd love to be on the future because, as you know, I've studied films as well. And, another great episode would be studying as far as the influences. And Geen would play a big part, obviously, with Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So I'd love to be on again. This was a great time.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You have been listening to another episode of the Necronomicast, broadcast, recorded, produced in Omaha, Nebraska, loud and proud. That John Borowski, man, super talented. I don't know how he slept at night after making that Albert Fish documentary, though. Man, Albert Fish, whew. What a weirdo. There's another weirder out there. On saxophone, Mr. Andrew Vogt. Take a bow, Andrew. So we got a lot more shows coming down the pike. We got some in the can that I'm editing as we speak, trying to get them out to you. More true tales from Hollywood. Filmmakers, movie makers. We got true crime. We've got paranormal. We got it all coming your way. Now make sure you go to our website, would you? Call the show. Email the show. Go down to the review section of iTunes. Make sure you leave a review for us. This was episode number 186. Copyright 2020. All right, everybody, go get some sleep.